We know he's with you today, right now, in your presence. And we thank you, Lord, that he's not suffering right now. And we look forward to the day that we'll see him again. We ask you to bless this service and all that it holds. God, let your grace and peace be upon everyone here, especially for Amanda and Matt and the family. We love you, Jesus. Amen. We're going to get things started this morning with a song. Betty is going to come with Natalie, and I'm going to try to help them for a minute too.
Over fields that I've sown, you've waded with me through deep waters. You've shaded my eyes from the hot summer sun. You filled my every need in every way. When I needed a friend, you were right by my side. The touch of your hand made me stronger. But my journey's not over. There are valleys to cross, so walk with me the rest of the way. Walk with me the rest of the way. Hold my hand if I stumble, guide my feet if I stray. For my journey's not over. There are valleys to cross, so walk with me the rest of the way. Walk with me the rest of the way. Hold my hand if I stumble, guide my feet if I stray. For my journey's not over. There are valleys to cross, so walk with me the rest of the way. Lord, walk with me the rest of the way.
that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
Now, Jimmy's great niece, Katie, is going to come and share a story of Jimmy's life.
I have to say that every time we went to the Commodore to see him or I met one of his friends, he always said, "This is my great niece," and that's not just my opinion. It's my favorite joke in the whole world. Okay, all right, we can do this, right? We can do this. Do I need my glasses? We'll see. So, how do you say goodbye to someone who is woven into your life's fabric? Always there. I have been working for a week on the words to say here. And what is the best way to honor such a special person as Jimmy Payne? I mean, I can literally say that I would not be standing here without Jimmy Payne because he introduced my parents to each other. And at a radio station event at KSTL in St. Louis, I'm going to ditch the glasses. This is not working. All right. So now many of you know his career highlights of his chart-topping success with Woman, Woman, co-written by Jen Glazer and recorded over 100 times in 15 different languages, most notably by Gary Puckett and the Union Gap. It's a really good crowd sing kind of song. You probably also know about Charlie Pride's #1 hit, My Eyes Can Only See As Far As You, and Dan Bobbitt is going to do a very nice rendition of it for us here pretty soon, which Jimmy co-wrote with Naomi Martin. And honestly, I am only able to cover such a small fraction of the things that could be told because Jimmy was such a hardworking and prolific writer. Those of you in this room that are songwriters, do we have a show of hands? Who in here is a songwriter? Oh yeah, see, yeah. You know he was hardworking and prolific, and he basically knew everybody. And if he didn't know you, he knew you soon after that. My hope today is to tell you some great little stories that you may not know. So before the pandemic, he had heard that I was recording my mom's stories to get those down, and he asked if I would record his and turn them into a book. So we got started, and we spent many hours just talking and recording, and a lot of it was over Zoom because the pandemic happened, and nobody could leave the house. And so I really cherish that time even more now, and I just want to share with you some of what came out of that. So Jimmy Payne was the youngest of 12 children, 9 living, and some of those grandchildren and great-grandchildren are here today. He He was born to Oscar and Stella Payne on Easter Sunday in 1936, somewhere between Leachville and Manila, Arkansas, not too far away from where Johnny Cash was born. Originally, his dad owned a gas station and a grocery store, but sold that when Jimmy was little, took his wife and 9 kids, and started sharecropping in southeast Missouri. They moved to Gideon in the Boot Heel around 1944. Jimmy said some of his earliest memories were waking up to the sounds of his dad filing the hoes that they used to chop cotton. So back in that day, and some of you will remember your grandparents telling these stories, the fabric for their shirts came from flour sacks. They would go to the store and they would pick the flour sack that they liked the pattern on. My grandmother would make him shirts, and my mom as well, shirts out of that. And he recalls one day being on the school bus with his sisters, and he sat down next to a girl only to realize that they were wearing the same flour sack pattern. He was 12, so you can imagine being in middle school and doing that. So his music making started when he was around 11 years old, and he got the idea to nail some flathead tacks to a board. Then he took wires out of the screen door and wrapped them around the tacks and nailed it down, and he put something under it to tighten it, and then he used a knife to strum it. And he actually got sound out of it and wrote a little song. But he said it didn't tune very well, so that didn't last long. So he needed a regular guitar. So they lived about 3 miles from town at the time when he was about 12. And one day he had saved enough money, and he walked down to the road, because at the time you got your money orders from the postman and then you would send them off. And so he went down to go meet the postman with his $12 so he wanted to buy a mandolin at that point. While he's waiting for the postman, his dad drives up in the car and says, "Son, what are you doing out here?" And he tells him what he's doing. He said, "Well, you need that money for clothes." And, Jimmy, he just wasn't a rebel, so he didn't fight it. He's like, "Well, that's the end of that." He goes back inside. Well, about 4 years later, he's 16, and he loves music. I mean, the bug has bitten him. And my grandmother, Bertha, who is his oldest sister, she sees that, and she wants to support that. So she walks with him down to the post office because she's ready for her dad. She ain't taking nothing off of him. And they go down there, and they meet the postman, and he gives them the money order, and he orders a $16 guitar from Sears and Roebuck. And that's how he got started. And I was wondering what kind of stories we would be telling today if he had actually purchased the mandolin instead of the guitar. Would we be doing a different genre here? I don't know. So my grandmother was the oldest of all the kids, and Jimmy was the youngest. Because of their difference in age, he and my mom, Betty, the one that just sang, are only about 4 years apart. They grew up basically like siblings. Coming from tenant farmers in southeast Missouri, they spent a great deal of their time in the cotton fields, and they passed the time singing gospel and country songs out while they were hoeing. It turns out they were pretty good at it. They were invited as guests to sing a regular spot on KTCB in Malden with their friends Jack and Dottie Rose. They started getting all kinds of mail and requests, and so the radio station says, "Hey, would you like your own show?" Sure. So they had their own show for about a year. And then after that, they also entered a talent show for a Kennett radio station sponsored by Jack Sprat Canned Foods. The winner was determined by who could collect the most Jack Sprat labels. So they saved labels, they asked their relatives for labels, they searched the dump for whatever they could find, and ultimately they came in third. So Jimmy credited so much of his early musical mentoring to Jack Campbell, who played at the Bethel Assembly of God Church in Gideon, and he allowed Jimmy and his friends Billy Walker and Kenneth Meadows to play for the service with him. Jimmy, and he was a teenager, and Jimmy remembers Jack patiently laying his hand on Jimmy's guitar strings to deaden them when he was noodling around too much during the service. Jimmy remembered being inspired by his dad listening to the Grand Ole Opry and other country shows on the radio, and he credited his own mother, Stella, for spurring his interest in the harmonica, because apparently she played harmonica, and I bet you money none of my family knows that, because my mom did not know that until last night, that Granny Payne played the harmonica. And so he learned how to play and got pretty good at that as well, as we just heard on Amazing Grace. So all of these dreams and inspirations took place alongside the cotton farming, and he told me one time, and I quote, he said, "I would pick a long cotton row, and then I would sit down on my cotton sack and look toward the east and dream about someday I'll be in Nashville. And I didn't know how I was going to get there, but that was part of my early dreams. I would sit and look east, and on a good day, in my mind's eye, I could see Nashville. So now as Jimmy grew older, his siblings began marrying and moving out, which meant fewer hands to work on the farm. Jimmy had no interest in a life of farming, much to his dad's disappointment. So in 1959, the Army did him a solid and drafted him, got him out of there. At first, it seemed like a disruption in his life, but it actually became a major turning point. His first time to play on a real stage was in the Army, starting at Fort Gordon in Georgia. And after transferring to Fort Lewis in Washington, he met a guy looking for talent to start an Army band, and this guy's name was Chuck Glazer. Jimmy knew who Chuck was right off the bat from the Glazer brothers' work on the Grand Ole Opry and as backup singers for Marty Robbins. So this is where Jimmy really started to hone his skills singing and playing on stage. This Army band played all over the country on weekends and even earned him enough money to fly home to visit St. Louis. He did this for about 18 months, playing in a few other groups during that time. I think The Ventures was one of them, Mom was telling me this morning. After 2 years in the Army, he came back to St. Louis and back to his job at the metal finishing shop at Dynacraft, spray painting parts for the aeronautics industry. Of course, this was just a temporary job while pursuing what he really loved. And there is so much I could say about his music career, but it would take me all day. So I'm just going to rattle off a few quick fun stories here. So Jimmy, at one point, traveled with the USO, and they did, I think, a 10-week tour to Southeast Asia, including South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Iwo Jima. They played one show close to North Korea, and there was a skirmish going on over the border, and after they boarded the bus after the show, there was a group of soldiers that joined them on the bus and pointed guns at them. They didn't know if they were North or South Korea. I think they assumed that they were South because eventually the guys got off the bus and left them alone. They were pretty shaken up by that. They also played a show on Iwo Jima right before the U.S. gave the island back to Japan. He said there was smoke coming up from the ground the entire time they were there, and the whole place smelled like sulfur. His debut on the Grand Ole Opry one night was pretty successful. The Glazer brothers were hosting, and after Jimmy played, he got 3 encores. Yes, go Jimmy. Another night, and it may have even been the same night, Dan said something today that made me thought that it was. Another night, Bill Monroe introduced him on the Opry, and any of you bluegrass fans out there know Bill Monroe talked pretty fast, and he talked so fast that Jimmy didn't even know he had been introduced. So he's still waiting in the wings, and Bill's turning around going, hey, wait, where is he? And another band is like, come on. So he'd been a little embarrassed by that. Another fun fact, after he signed with Epic Records as an artist in the mid-'60s, he was pitched a bunch of songs by the great Chris Christopherson, wanting Jimmy to sing his songs. Jimmy was part of the early Music Row scene where songwriters hung out in alleyways and places like Line Bars, tapes in hand, and producers and singers would go looking for them, searching for songs to record that day. Boy, what a change. At that time, Tammy Wynette found him and asked him for songs and cut a few of them. A few of his co-writes, one including Broad-Minded, which he wrote with Leona Williams, and she also cut I Did My Best to Fall in Love Last Night, which he actually originally pitched to George Jones. So there was the time that he was doing a session for Glazer Publishing, singing a song he wrote with Gene Brantley called Rags for Amos, about a guy who had just picked up rags in the neighborhood. Apparently, Dolly Parton was in the session that day and later told Chuck Glazer that it had inspired her to write Coat of Many Colors. Jimmy was good friends with the Glazer brothers ever since his days in the Army. He signed a publishing deal with Chuck, who he also introduced to John Hartford, my dad. He co-wrote Woman, Woman and many other hits with Jim Glazer. He also remembered being in Tom Paul Glazer's publishing office one day when Johnny Cash came by to hear a song, still dazed and distracted from the night before. And Tom Paul had to tackle Johnny and literally wrestle him to the ground just to get him to listen to the song. Jimmy's sitting over here off to the side watching the whole thing go. Jimmy began touring England with Tom Paul after the brothers went their separate ways musically and became a big hit there. It was in England where he met Ann and Bill Trice, presidents of his fan club who later became Amanda's godparents. And he was also a big hit at the Wembley Festival, where he played several times. He wrote My Eyes Can Only See As Far As You with Naomi Martin in February of '67. Around the same time, he co-wrote Woman, Woman with Jim Glazer. Story behind that, apparently he was visiting Naomi and her family, and they were all sitting around eating and playing music. He was smoking back then, and his cigarette fell out of the ashtray and burnt a hole in the top of her beautiful Ethan Allen table. She said, "Don't worry, it's not a big deal," but he felt bad about it, so the next visit he said, "Hey, here's a song title, let's write it." And, which I guess was his penance for burning a hole in the table. So remember that when you sing, Dan, that, there's a lot of emotion behind that song. And apparently Naomi's daughter still has the table. Bill Holmes, Joe's brother and Jennifer's dad, got to call Jimmy and tell him that Charlie Pride recorded the song. Jimmy figured it would be just an album cut, but it turned out to be the single and a very big #1 hit for Charlie. And now there's even a reggae version. Did you know that? It's really good. And how many of you know that Jimmy has a co-write with T.I., the rapper? We got a couple. It's on a song called Who Wants Some? And Jimmy had no idea until he noticed a significant increase in his royalty check one month. Apparently, T.I. took a sample from Woman, Woman and wanted to give proper credit. So if you look the song up, the writing credits list, you can Google this, T.I., Cedric L. Young, DJ Toomp, Jimmy Payne, and Jim Glazer. So I asked Jimmy one day about his songwriting process. He told me so many things about how he comes up with a song, and part of it was looking at the people in his songs as characters he is observing, waiting to see what they're going to do so he can write about it. I think my favorite quote is this one. He said, "I came alive when these characters came alive. In fact, I think about these songs with these characters, and they're real people. And sometimes I try not to get an idea late at night because I create these people that don't want to go to bed when I do." So now I know I've talked a lot about Jimmy's early life and career, and he's done so many cool things, but he would tell you that none of it compares to his love for his family. He married the love of his life, Virginia Jo Holmes, in 1969. I was there. I was only 6 weeks old, so I don't remember much. He did me the same by being at my wedding here about 31 years ago. She was completely supportive of his career and a balancing force in his life. His precious daughter, Amanda, was born in 1977, and Jimmy's life completely refocused. He adored her. It's possible that he could have gone on to be more of a household name, but he was unwilling to sacrifice his family for that. In fact, a promoter in England tried once to get out of paying for Joe to come with him on tour, and he got up and walked out of the room and said, "No deal." Okay, how many people have the guts to do that? That was Jimmy Payne. Joe and Amanda often accompanied him, whether it was on his tours of England or playing at the Commodore. He enjoyed just being with them and later his wonderful son-in-law Matt, and his 2 grandpups, Buddy and Sissy. Matt and Amanda took such good care of Jimmy and Joe in their later years, and I just want you all to keep them in your prayers because there's a real big hole in the fabric right now. I am so incredibly grateful that with Joe having passed in May, he got on a plane last fall and came up to Boston to visit us right before Thanksgiving. We met him at the airport, and we had his song, Boston, playing on the radio when he got in the car. He told me he had only been through Boston once before. He had just come back from an overseas tour with Carl Perkins and Dorothy Ritter, who was Tex Ritter's wife. She wanted to show Jimmy and Carl around the city and show them all the things that she loved about the area, but they were tired and they just wanted to sleep, so they went to their hotel room and sleep. So last fall, he finally got to see the city that he had written about. We took him out to the Cape to see the ocean, to walk famous pathways and see historic buildings. He loved it all. We sat by the harbor and imagined what it was like to witness the Boston Tea Party. I found a jukebox in a diner that had a couple of his songs on it, and I played them without telling him, and he was pretty tickled. We even got to feed him his very first oyster, and he was not impressed. Jimmy loved Jesus, and I believe that he is with him right now, along with Aunt Jo and so many friends and family that he loved and missed dearly. Amanda, Mom, and I were with him at the hospital a few days prior to his passing. Now, for those of you that knew him, know that he was a bit of a social butterfly. He loved an audience, and he always wanted to be in the conversation. The nurses would give him pain meds and things to help him sleep, and he might doze for 30 or 40 minutes, but then he'd hear the slightest sound, and he'd be up again, wanting to know what was going on. He didn't want to miss anything. So at one point on Thursday, Amanda, Mom, and I were standing on either side of his bed, and he was looking past us. He was talking and mumbling a bit and asked a couple of times about all those people over there. We looked at each other, then asked if he recognized anyone, and he said no. Then he picked up his hand and he waved. The sweetest wave I've ever seen at whoever it was that he was seeing. It certainly wasn't us. Several times that afternoon, I tested him out and I looked at him and I said, "Hi," and waved to him just to see that sweet wave. And he always waved back, looking directly at me. And then at one point he said, "Why are you waving at me?" I tell this story because it would be easy to brush off that vision of all these people as pain meds. But the three of us can tell you that he was completely and clearly cognizant, cracking jokes and keeping us on our toes. He was all there. His body just wasn't cooperating. And he saw something and someone, and I believe he saw hope. Jimmy was kind, he was accepting, and he truly wanted to do the right thing always. There are so few people in this world, from my observation, that are as pure-hearted as Jimmy Payne. He was funny, had an amazing sense of humor, and I always knew he would get the joke. I don't think he had any natural enemies. He was a gentle soul. He valued everyone he knew, no matter what they looked like, where they came from, or what they believed. As long as they were in tune, he held space for them. The musicians got that. He knew who he was, and he pursued the talents and giftings he had been given. He lived a faithful life of over 87 years and was busy enough with projects and ideas to have filled another 87. So there are so many stories I haven't told you, but there's a really important one that I have not told you, and that's Jimmy and Joe's love story. And I've not told you because I want him to tell you himself in his own words. I'm going to leave you with this excerpt from our interviews. I'll give you the caveat that it was done over Zoom during the pandemic, and not knowing that this would be used later in public, I was eating breakfast. So please excuse the clinking and the whatever you hear in there. We tried to edit it, but this is as far as we got. But I think you will enjoy it, so I'll let him finish.
Can we talk about how you met Aunt Jo?
Well, I'll tell you, I was playing guitar in a little church in North St. Louis where I was staying up there with, I think it was Vanita, and I'm not sure who was head of the household, but I was a professional house guest there again. And so anyway, I was living there. That's when I first went to St. Louis. We were living in North St. Louis, and I went to a little Pentecostal church. And Jo and her family came and sang at that church, and I played guitar. I don't know. I had a sport coat and Levi's on back then. I don't think it was that popular at that time, but that's just the way I dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And years later, everybody started copying me. You know.
You were a trendsetter. You were an influencer.
Yeah, I was a trendsetter and never got paid for it.
That's right.
You know? But anyway, Jo made a comment. She told me later that she said, "That's my man if I never get him." I should be letting her tell this story, but I mean, that's the way I remember that she told me that she thought that night. And I played guitar for them.
Okay.
And so then we kind of developed a friendship. I don't know what our next meeting would have been like. But later, then we moved to South St. Louis. I was there with Bertha and Betty then. Mm-hmm. And and they lived in South St. Louis. They lived probably less than a mile from us. We just all became good friends, and we started going to church at the same place then, you know. And so we knew each other. We saw each other every day, or every time we went to church. And back in those days, Betty and I sang in church together. We had taught probably several times before. That's my early kickstart days into the music. Anyway, we were just good friends. There was always a spark there, but I never called it love, you know? And, I mean, not in love anyway. I never thought about us being in love. And so it went on and on and on. And, then I moved to Nashville, and I would still go back there. And then I think that you know this story here that I'm getting ready to tell. And then my mom, my dad was deceased, I think, back in about 1963. And this was 1968 now that I'm talking about. I had, after 2 years after I moved to Nashville, I was playing up in Washington, D.C., and I called Bertha, your grandma, and told her I was on the way home and everything. And she said, "Oh, by the way, guess who got married?" And my heart just sunk. That's the first time I ever realized that I really was in love with Joe.
Aww.
And it was my mom she was talking about.
Oh. And you weren't worried about her.
Bertha had the ability to just lay it all out there, you know, without worrying about it, how it might hurt somebody.
Yeah.
She just laid it all out there. But she was talking about my mother, and so I was actually relieved when she said that, you know.
Okay.
And I realized that I had to do something about it.
Yeah.
You know, and all this time, and you never. I mean, I had heard about that like that, how you could be in love with somebody but not know it until a certain event. Yeah. And so I started looking at her different then, and when I went up there, we would start talking seriously about the future. You know, and then one day, you know, I asked her to marry me.
That's great, isn't it? Dan Bobbitt's going to come and sing one of Jimmy's songs.
I was honored and scared to be asked to do this song, and thanks. And I met Jimmy in '95 in the foyer back there. He and Jerry Chestnut, and asked me why I moved here, and I said to write songs. And Jimmy right away said, "Let's write." And the next week we were writing a song. We had a car situation, and he came and got me. We talked a lot. I love to talk. Jimmy does too. And if you knew him, you loved him. And boy, I sure did love him. And we didn't write a lot. You know, we wrote, but we didn't finish anything. And I thought, oh man, I just wrote with a hit songwriter and didn't finish the song. Does that mean I'm a bad writer? You know? And so I remember about to get out of the car, and Jimmy said, "Keep your chin up." He said, "We're going to write again. We're going to finish that song." So, and we did, and we finished a bunch. But I'm going to get through this hopefully here. So Amanda asked me to do "My Eyes Can Only See As Far As You," which was his Charlie Pride's 16th #1 record. And, you know, I'd never really sang the song, so as I was singing it, the tempo, more I sang it, the more I got scared, the closer this thing got. So I sped up it a little bit. So anyway, here we go. And oh, my eyes can only see as far as you. I've stopped searching all the faces in the crowd. I don't ever want to find somebody I'm content with loneliness if you're not in my arms, 'cause my eyes can only see as far as you. My heart is set on loving you forever, and your love is strong enough to get me through. It'll keep me holding on to you forever, 'cause my eyes can only see as far as you. It'll keep me holding on to you forever, 'cause my eyes can only see as far as you. Yes, my eyes can only see as far as you.
Thank you, Dan. Well, it is such an honor to be able to participate in the celebration of life for my friend Jimmy Payne. Wonderful man who affected so many lives. Just 1 second here, sorry. Jimmy was many things. He was a kind and generous man. He was a devoted husband and father. He was a great friend. Who can testify to that? He was a dedicated and talented songwriter and artist and musician. And he was a faithful and committed follower of Jesus. He was devoted to his church and he was devoted to God. My wife Sonia and I moved here just about a year and a half ago, last January, to serve as pastors here at Oak Hill. And one of the first names that I heard mentioned by the people of the church was Jimmy Payne. I was told about the physical battle that he had been fighting during the pandemic and how he almost died, but he fought back and he was getting stronger every day. Not long after we got here, I placed a call to Jimmy to introduce myself to him over the phone and have a word of prayer with him. And like I said, I'd heard his name several times. I knew a little bit about him. I knew that he was a hit songwriter, and I knew about the illness that he and his wife Jo were fighting together at the time, but that's pretty much it. I knew that much. And calls like this for a pastor are normally a little bit awkward when you don't know each other. But I've done these kinds of calls many times over the years. I've served in some very large churches where it was common for me not to know much about somebody that I was praying with over the phone. And one thing that's usually a given about these types of pastoral care calls is they're normally a little bit brief. They're normally short. They're almost 15, 20 minutes max usually when you're making a call like this. After all, you're making conversation with someone that you've just met over the phone. They're basically a stranger to you. You usually run out of some things to talk about after a few minutes. But if you know Jimmy very well, you know what I'm about to say. If you've ever talked to him on the phone, you know what I am about to say. My first conversation with Jimmy Payne on the phone lasted well over an hour. There were no awkward pauses. No one was ever searching for anything to say. It was almost like we were old friends. When I got off the phone, I smiled and said, "I like that guy." That was the start of a friendship that will always be special to me. Jimmy and I have talked for hours over this last year and a half. We've spent lots of time together. He took me with him to the hospital to meet Jo for the first time when she was struggling with the illness. Like most of you, I've heard lots of great stories from Jimmy. I heard about the guy at the Grand Ole Opry that asked him for his union card right before he went out. I don't think Jimmy liked that very much because I heard that story several times. I've heard about the inspiration for how he and Jim Glazer wrote Woman, Woman. I've heard about how he and Jerry Chestnut would get together at 4 a.m. because that's when Jerry felt like he could be the most creative. I've heard about his travels to Europe and early days back in St. Louis. And most of all, I've heard him tell how thankful he was for the people in his life. I've probably heard him mention all of you at one time or another in our conversations. He spent a lot of time over this last year remembering people who made a difference in his life. I've heard him talk about how thankful he was for Jo, for the person she was, for her faithfulness and love, how she loved the Lord and she loved her family and she inspired him. You know, if you listen to Jimmy's cheating songs, you might wonder what in the world kind of woman he was married to. But there's no doubt Jo was the love of his life, and she made his life better in every way. Best of all, Jimmy knew that. He knew that and Jo was the prize of his life. He knew how blessed he was to have found her, and he missed her every day since she left us last year. I also heard him talk about how proud he was of Amanda and Matt. Amanda, you were the apple of your dad's eye. He cherished you so much. He was so thankful for you, and he was so proud of you. On more than one occasion, he told me how thankful he was for the ways that you and Matt had sacrificed to help him during these last years when he and your mom needed you. Thank you. You've demonstrated to everybody what loving your parents in their senior years is supposed to look like. You've shouldered the responsibility, and you did it without complaining. I've never once heard either one of you whine or complain about how hard life was. You loved your mom and dad, and you did it very, very well. Thank you. Thank you. Also, I heard Jimmy talk about his friends. Everything reminded Jimmy of a story, and everyone in here was probably part of at least one of those stories. Friends were very important to Jimmy. You could tell that by the way that he talked. You could hear it in the kindness in his voice and how he never wanted to say a cross word. Friends were important to him. Even if he was talking about someone who did something he didn't like, he never talked about it with anger or resentment in his voice. It was just something that happened a long time ago. Did you notice that about him? Did you pick that up along the way? He never seemed rattled or fearful. He didn't seem to carry deep resentments and allow deep pain to define him. Jimmy seemed to me, at least, somebody who didn't know him very long, to be a man who lived at peace. He was at peace with God, and he was at peace with the people around him. And that's a very, very special thing, to live at peace. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul talks about this kind of peace. He calls it the peace that transcends understanding. It's the natural byproduct of a life that's truly built on Jesus. I saw this in Jimmy many times, and at a time like this, when we're saying goodbye for now to someone so loved, so special, that peace is what we all need. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul not only talks about this peace, but he tells us how we can have this peace, how it can be ours. And it's a great roadmap for how we should live our lives. But it's more than that. It's especially good for finding peace during a season of grief. Let me show you real quick what I mean. There were a couple of ladies in this church at Philippi who apparently weren't getting along. They were fighting and arguing. And Paul pled with them to put their differences aside and to mend their friendship. And then he said the most interesting thing. He said, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." I think that's what we all need, don't you? Peace. We need the peace of God that transcends understanding to guard our hearts and minds, especially in a season of loss. But how? How do we get that kind of peace? First, Paul says that we should rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord, he says. Always rejoice. I say it again, rejoice. But what does rejoicing look like when you've lost somebody that you love? It might seem a little weird or insensitive for me to stand here and say, Amanda, you should rejoice. Betty, you should rejoice. But I'm here today to tell you that's exactly what we should do. It might seem strange, but it's good advice. I'm not talking about ignoring your pain. I'm not talking about putting on a brave face. I'm talking about celebrating the wonderful ways that Jimmy made a difference in your life and the great ways that God worked through him to make your life better. Everyone in here could tell a story of how Jimmy made your life better. Some of you owe him a debt of gratitude. He was there when you needed a friend. He shared an encouraging word when you needed it. He gave you an opportunity to write with him when you needed somebody to give you a shot. He maybe asked you to be a part of something that he was doing. Many of you would say, that's true. That's who Jimmy was to me. A great way to honor Jimmy, a great way to deal with the feelings of loss is to celebrate what Jimmy meant to you. Talk about the ways he made your life better. Tell people what he did, what he said to you when you needed to hear an encouraging word. In other words, rejoice. Rejoice because you could call Jimmy Payne your friend, your dad, your father-in-law, your uncle, your songwriting buddy. The second thing Paul said to the Philippians when he was telling them how to find peace was this: be kind and gentle with the people around you. He said, let your gentleness be evident to all. And that's something that I saw in Jimmy many times. You know, we use the word gentleman in everyday life. And what we usually mean by that when we say, oh, he's a gentleman, is he carries himself with dignity and respect. Or maybe he has good manners. He says yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and opens doors for the ladies. That's what we usually mean when we say the word gentleman. But as great as those things are, those are not really descriptive of what gentleman is supposed to mean. What the word gentleman is meant to describe is a man who, although he could choose to be brash and demanding, although he could choose to use forceful words and actions to get what he wants, instead, he chooses to be gentle. He's a gentle man. Jimmy Payne was a gentle man. And don't get me wrong, Jimmy wasn't weak. He wasn't passive. He was gentle. He was kind. Now, sure, it was his nature to be kind and gentle. Absolutely. It is just the way he was. But it's also a choice that Jimmy made. Jimmy chose to be gentle in the way that he dealt with people because Jimmy knew something. He knew that gentleness was something that God wanted to see in his life. Jimmy knew that gentleness pleases God, and he committed himself to being the kind of man who pleases God. That's a choice that every one of us in this room should make. And the great news is it's never too late to make that choice. No matter what you've done, no matter how you've failed, you can choose to please God in the way that you live your life, even right now. You can surrender to Him and you can accept His grace and His mercy. And then you can devote yourself to living a life that pleases God, just like Jimmy did. Paul went on to say, don't be anxious, but in every situation, pray. And that's one of the most important keys to finding peace when you need it. Take your anxiety and your grief to Jesus. Pray. I've seen the power of this in my life many times over the years. It's one of the reasons why I feel so sad for people who don't know Jesus. I honestly don't know how people make it through times like this without the love and the grace of God at work in their lives. Time and again, I found myself feeling overwhelmed and anxious, dealing with fear, regret, uncertainty, hurt, whatever the emotion may be. But then I remember to take those things to Jesus in prayer, and everything changes. In a moment, despair gives way to hope. Anxiety surrenders to peace. It's a powerful thing when you're going through a season of pain and loss. Take your anxiety and grief to Jesus. The last several years of Jimmy's life on earth were not easy. They were anything but easy. He endured a lot, but so did some of you. There were sleepless nights. You sat by the bedside for both Jimmy and Joe for hours. You encouraged them both when they were suffering, but you were suffering right along with them. You listened to the doctor's reports and you tried to help them make the best decisions. You prayed over and over for God's help. And you know what? God heard you. God saw your tears and He heard your cries. Now, I know things didn't work out the way that we all wanted them to work out. We all wanted to hear Jimmy sing again. We all wanted to see that smile again and hear him say, "Hey, buddy." But here's what we all need to see. Jimmy right now, right in this moment, he's experiencing the ultimate answer to every one of the prayers that you've prayed. No suffering, no pain, reunited with his sweetheart in the presence of Jesus. There's no greater answer to any prayer that you've ever prayed for Jimmy Payne than that. He's in the beautiful presence of the Most High God right now. Psalm 16 says, "In the presence of the Lord is the fullness of joy." Jimmy is experiencing the fullness of joy right now. That's joy in its truest, purest sense. That's an amazing realization. But here's something that everybody in this room needs to know. You can experience the same joy too. And I'm not talking about when you go to heaven. I'm talking about right here, right now. Jesus sent us His Spirit as comforter and advisor and strength. And when you turn to God in prayer and you invite His Spirit to be with you, you get a little taste of what heaven's going to be like. Just a little taste. Years ago, there was a terrible accident that happened in my family. My mom was seriously injured, and I was just 9 years old. She spent several days in the hospital. It was just about the scariest thing that I could imagine in the world at 9 years old. And for around a week, my family was turned upside down. My dad was staying at the hospital with my mom. My brothers and I were staying with family. And I felt like the world was crashing down around me. But I'll never forget my dad's first night back home. I'd been so afraid, but my dad was with us at home now. It seemed like everything was going to be fine. Mom was going to get to come home in the next day or two. And my dad sat down on the couch in our living room that night, and he opened up his Bible. And I sat down on the couch right next to him as he read and prayed silently. He didn't say a word. I didn't say a word. Neither of us did. But I sensed something in that room. I sensed God's presence and peace in such a powerful and unmistakable way as I sat there next to my dad. That's one of the first times in my life I remember sensing God's presence and His peace in that way. It was unmistakable. And I've sensed that many times over the years since then. And here's what I've learned from that. God is waiting for you. He's waiting for you. He's expecting you. And what He has in store for you can only be found in reaching out toward Him from the deepest part of you. And when you receive it, it's called the peace of God, which transcends understanding. When you experience that, when you're in the presence of God, you are in the same place that Jimmy Payne is in right now. There's a scripture that's read at nearly every funeral, every memorial service. It's Psalm 116. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. And I've always loved that verse, but it seems a little strange when you stop and you think about it. Why would Jimmy's death be precious? Why would God see death as a precious thing? If it's precious, it means, in a sense, it's a good thing. Why would God see death as a good thing? I think Jimmy's death is precious to God because in this death is a testimony of God's love and his faithfulness to the world. Jimmy's life bore witness to God and who he is. And you want to know that God is loving and kind? You want proof? Look at the way Jimmy Payne lived his life. You want to know God is real? Look at the way Jimmy Payne lived his life. Today, a child of God named Jimmy Payne finds himself surrounded by other children of God who've gone before him in a place where beauty and peace is all that is ever known. There's no more sickness, no more pain. He's experiencing pure joy in the presence of God even now. And that's the reward that waits for each of us who know Jesus and walk with him. I'm glad to be able to call Jimmy Payne my friend. But my friendship with Jimmy didn't end the day that he took his last breath at Skyline Hospital in Nashville. Because here's what I know. I'm going to see my friend again one day. Here on earth, our friendship was framed by the pain and physical challenges he faced over the last several years. I didn't know him any other way. But one day I'm going to see Jimmy Payne dancing on streets of gold. He's not going to have his cane anymore because he's not going to need it. He's not going to be having trouble with his balance anymore. I'm going to see him and Miss Jo in a way that I never got to know them here on earth. He's going to be able to see just fine. He's not going to have to worry about how he's going to get to his doctor's appointments. His voice is going to be young again. He's going to be able to reach all those high notes that he used to be able to reach. I can't wait to hear the songs that Jimmy Payne has written since he's been to heaven. I can't wait to see how God has made his faith sight. And the question is, the important question is, will you be there too? Will you get to see Jimmy the way that I'm going to see him one day? And you can answer that question today. You can walk out of here with the full assurance that you're going to see Jimmy again and have assurance, blessed assurance. I'd like to ask you to bow your heads real quick, and I'd just like to pray for you. Father, I ask you in the name of Jesus to reveal yourself to anybody who's here, friends of Jimmy, family of Jimmy, who don't know you in the way that Jimmy did and aren't walking with you in the way he did. Lord, I pray that you'd reveal your love and your strength to them. Reveal your grace. Father, draw them to yourself and bring them into your family and help them discover everything that Jimmy discovered in you. And Lord, I pray for your peace that transcends understanding to guard the minds of your people. Lord, touch Matt and Amanda, surround them with your glory and your presence. God, I pray for Betty and Katie and the family, Lord, that you just surround them with your presence. And everybody who loved Jimmy, God, as we look forward to the day that we see him again in heaven, we say, come quickly, Lord Jesus. We love you, Lord. Amen. Amen. Matt's going to come now, direct you.
I was going to be funny. Toby Keith sung a song, said, I want to talk about me. Said, me, oh my, and enough about you, I want to talk about me. And man, did Jimmy love to talk about himself. He really did. We would tell him, hey, we're going to see Alabama. Well, I opened, or Alabama opened for me in one time on stage. Oh, okay, Jimmy. Or we're going to Florida. Well, I used to play Floribama. And, oh, okay, Jimmy. And I'm going to California. Well, man, I played California. That's where they heard my song, was in California. All right, Jimmy. All right. But as you can see, with all these stories and all his accolades, it's no wonder he wanted to talk about himself. I mean, this guy did a lot, coming from picking cotton to writing #1 hits. So, we're going to give you a chance right now. I'm going to come if you raise your hand, and we're going to give you a chance to talk about him. If you have a story or if you want to tell something, we'd like it to be under 2 minutes, and I may pull the mic from you. That's why they had me do this. So if you raise your hand right now, I'm going to come to you, and I'd love for you to tell your story about Jimmy. Yes, sir.
My name is Ernie Sykes. I'm a musician, but one of the things that nobody mentioned is that Jimmy was a real good house painter, and he painted one of my rooms in the house. And there was all kinds of talking. He talked about himself and his music, his career, and, which I expected. But when he got all done with the painting, I said, there's only one more thing that I need you to do, Jimmy. And I may have the only one of these, but I had him sign the wall. So that's all.
Well, good. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, I'm Chris Midget. I met Jimmy several years ago. I did a Christmas charity with Glenn and Dottie Tubb, and he would always come and play at all of our events. And then we all, after Glenn passed, we all kind of fell, didn't see each other as much. But then this past December, Jimmy came and sang at our 10th anniversary, and he made sure and got to Mount Juliet and did it. And we talked forever on the phone getting ready for that. But I'm definitely going to miss Jimmy. He was amazing.
Yes, sir.
I'm Bob Langford. My mom and dad and my brother were fortunate enough to minister at Belmont Assembly. Betty, how long ago? I can't. Honestly, when you all came, it's been a long time. We were all kind of grew up together, and we had a wonderful time. But three things come to my mind. First thing, I want everybody just look at the picture. Just take a quick look at the picture. I think there's a word we haven't said today, and that's mischievous. I mean, seriously, look at that. He looks like you just asked him if he ate the last cookie on the platter. That's the look you would get right there. He would often do things for our family. And I remember one time we said, hey, we're going to have a singing, and it grew out to where we would have regular singings at our home in our basement. And Jimmy came, and one night I said, Jimmy, we're going to make tonight a songwriter's night. He said, oh, that's going to be fun. Who all's there? I said, just you, but but we're going to make it a songwriter's night. And he said, it's going to be a short night. And the last thing that came to mind is that you can't out-minister Jimmy and Joe. In fact, it's Jimmy and Joe was kind of like, you got to say it together. And they ministered our family in so many ways, right up to the very end. And so Joe would often fix meals for my mother and dad. And when Dad passed, he would fix them for Mom. And Jimmy would bring them over and set them down on a little table outside the back door at Mom's house. And then he'd call and say, Sister Lita, I've got you a little present from Joe. And he'd always leave. So one day I ran into him and I said, Jimmy, you're always so sweet to bring those over. He said, oh, Bob, it's Joe's blessing and gives me a chance to get out. And I said, well, next time you come on up and talk to Mom and Richard a while. He said, I don't need to be out that long. So, we love him. It was hard to out-minister Jim and Joe, and we were recipients of their ministry, and we love them very much.
Yes, sir.
Chris, I believe it was your Christmas party where I met Jimmy. It was also the same night I met Glenn and Dottie Tubb. And it was all because of Jenny C. Riley. I was once told you can't meet someone and make a friend in 5 minutes for life. If that's true, you never met Jimmy Payne. I'll never forget, I was at John A's, and I'm a smoker. Everybody raise your hand that smokes. And Jimmy came out on the front porch, and he was talking to me, and he wasn't condemnative. He just looked at me and said, son, you know, you need to quit those. You'd be in better health. And I said, Mr. Jimmy, this keeps me from killing a lot of people. He told me about his smoking and how many times he had quit. That conversation probably lasted 30 to 45 minutes, and I lit up another cigarette, and Jimmy looked at me and said, son, I want you to remember something. Every time you light one of those, Jimmy Payne is praying for you. That has struck me many times since I met Jimmy. I believe it was in 2011. But for the past several weeks, it's at least twice a day. Jimmy died on May 15th. That was my birthday. A year ago on May 15th, my favorite uncle passed away. He and Jimmy reminded me so much of each other. And I nicknamed Jimmy a long time ago King James. Because Jimmy, if he told you something, he was telling you the truth. He didn't lie to you. He didn't sugarcoat it. He was straight up. And he'd often call me and we'd chat. And I'd answer the phone and I'd look down and say, King James. I'd pick up the phone and say, hello, King James, what's happening? I'd say, Clint Meister, what you doing? I'm going to miss those calls. Jimmy and Joe were a real part of our family. They were one of the few select people that we had adopted to be our family when we came in Nashville, because Terry and I one had family here. When we got married, Jimmy and Joe hosted our reception. So they are definitely an intricate part of our family, and he will be missed. Thank you, Matt.
Anybody else?
I have a hard time standing, but let me get this over with real quick. Back in 1987, I moved to Nashville from Oklahoma for a job. And I went to this little old small church, and this girl came up to me and she said, hey, I'm Marilyn Jones. And I met her, and she's here. But next thing I met was Jimmy and Joe Payne, and when they were going to Joywood Assembly. And Joe was taking care of Marilyn's two boys so that Marilyn could get on her feet to take care of herself and her two boys with her. And this is just what Joe and Jimmy did. They nurtured people, and they helped people to get established. And they ministered to me in ways that I could never have told you. So anyway, when it came time for the wedding, Joe planned the wedding with Marilyn to help her have a nice wedding and everything in our little church. And I was at the jeweler's that day of the wedding, and I had bought Marilyn a wrap for her ring, and the jeweler was supposed to get it put together to where I could give it to her that night. Excuse me. and it was late. And I was sitting at the jeweler, and I was supposed to be at the church. And I got there about 10 after 7. The wedding was at 7. I walked through the door. I got cutting eyes from Joe. And Jimmy leaned over and he said, "Second thoughts?" And I said, "No," and I told him the story. And he said, "Okay, let's get this show on the road." He was also the best man in my wedding. And they have both been precious through us throughout the years. I'll tell you one more little story. We were moving out of our house and into the house we're in now. It was New Year's Eve. We went by the old house to just check on it. And I walked in, and there was a flood coming from the upstairs in the attic. And the water heater had busted. I'd never seen a water heater in an attic before, but I had one. And the whole ceiling had fallen down, and it was on the ground. And so the couple days later, we called Jimmy out there, and he looked at it, and he said, "Well, we got some work to do." And that's about all he said. He didn't say, "Well, foolish thing for not turning the water off," or anything. He just, "You'll get through this. It's not a big deal." And we did. And he helped us put that house back together. And we'll always be forever grateful for what Jimmy was in our life. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Thanks, Matt. Hi, John Jackson, friend of Jimmy's for many, many years. I can't help but come, I attend church here, and I can't help coming into the back of the church and looking over there, because that's where Jimmy always sat, so that's a blessed pew over there. Jimmy Payne was a testimony to the human spirit, and what I mean by that is he was always creative. He never stopped being creative, thinking of new things, and many of your songwriters, I saw you raise your hand. He never stopped writing songs. He was always thinking about something new and different, kind of a, what do you call it, a hook? I think, what do you call it, the hook, whatever it is in the song. But even in his later years, the last couple of years, he was working on a song called Dream Stealers. Dream Stealers is a song about don't ever give it up. Don't ever give up your dreams. Don't ever do it. It's a cool song. I don't know what will ever happen to it, but I love that song, and I was always encouraging Jimmy to continue to improve it and get it to the point where it could be recorded. So Jimmy was a testimony to the human spirit, even at his age. Now, speaking of his age, I'm back in the back of the church one day after service, and Jimmy said something about doing something back in the day, and I said, "Well, Jimmy, how old are you?" And he looked at me and said, 62. Plus a few. And I love that, 62 plus a few. So all of you folks in the room here who are a little older than 62, the next time someone says to you, "Well, how old are you?" Say 62 plus a few, and when you do, remember Jimmy.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Lori Ingberg, and my husband was Robert K. Wolf. He was a songwriter in town, and we were always impressed by how generous of spirit Jimmy was, how accepting of younger, up-and-coming, wannabe talents, and he and Joe were such warm, caring people. When my husband was sick, they would call me and check on me and see if there was anything they could do with my husband so ill, and they just it was really humbling to have. I mean, Rob was like, here's this big hit songwriter, but he treats me like peers, you know. So I just wanted to attest to that. So thank you.
Thank you. You know, oh, go ahead, see that.
Sorry, I'll try to get through this without crying. This is more about me and my family, what I'm going to say. But I'm so thankful for Jimmy and Joe. Matt's my cousin, and we came here in 1998 and met Jimmy and Joe at this church. So I have beautiful memories of, I was in my 30s and I wanted a husband. I found a husband, and Joe had prayed for me. And my dad loved Jimmy and Joe, and we would go to to lunch every Sunday for years at Mazatlan. And they would play the guitars together. Their birthdays were a day apart. And I just want to say I'm really thankful for those beautiful memories that we had. I lost my parents. This is my sister. And we lost our parents. And then Matt lost his mom last year. And Amanda lost her mom. And Jimmy came over at Christmas time to my house with Matt's dad. He flew out here from California. And I just want to say this is, everybody gets older, but there's certain things when you grow up, you love stuff that's not around you anymore. And Jimmy came over, and I have 3 children, and it was such a joy for me to hear him play for my kids. He did a little concert, and I'm just really grateful that we got to do that. And I brought him. He had a concert after Joe died last year, and we had it at the church, and I remember filming it. And I'm just thankful that God allowed Jimmy and Joe in my life, and I have beautiful memories, and they loved the Lord, and they prayed for my husband, and I got a husband, and I'm grateful for that, and my family, and all of you here in this beautiful church. And that sounds funny, but I'm grateful how the Lord works things out and brings everything back together, and that our parents are together in heaven, and it's a beautiful thing to rejoice over that. So thank you, and this is a beautiful service, and I loved being here and hearing all these stories. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay, quick funny story.
Hi, I'm Tom, and I'm a songwriter, and I met Jimmy many, many years ago back at the old Broken Spoke. He was playing Woman, Woman, which was one of my favorite songs. But a few years back, I was at another songwriter's house, and I was doing some work for this lady, and Jimmy was there too. And I was in the bathroom, and I had taken a ladder and propped it up against the wall and then down on the tile to change a light fixture. While I was up there working, the ladder slipped. And as it went down, it hit the plug, and there was a breaker on the plug, and so the lights went out. So I'm laying on the floor, hurt, and I had hurt my middle finger on this hand. I didn't know it because it was pitch black. It just happened so quickly. And Jimmy heard the noise and came to the door. He said, "Tom, are you all right in there?" I said, "No, Jimmy, I'm hurt." He said, "Well, what's wrong?" I said, "I can't see, but my left hand is hurt." He said, "Well, let me see if I can get the door open." Well, the ladder was against the door. And he finally pushed it open about 3 inches, and some light came in, and I saw my middle finger pointed at 3 o'clock. I said, "Oh, I've dislocated my finger, Jimmy. It's really hurting." He goes, "Well, Tom, I had a friend once that did that. And he just took a hold of it and just pulled it right back up in place." And I looked at it, I thought, what have I got to lose? So I grabbed my finger, and I went, "Oh!" He goes, "What's wrong, Tom?" I said, "Well, I pushed it back up in place." He goes, "Now, Tom, I wasn't telling you to do that. I was telling you what my friend did." And I went, "Well, it worked, Jimmy." So I'll never forget that story.
That's just what we need. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Beth Bacon. I love country music, classic country music. And I read Jimmy's obituary, and I'm here to learn about him and your family, and I just am so blessed to be here.
Oh, thank you for coming.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and I used to attend here. And when I attended here, I usually sat up here. But there was one Sunday that for whatever reason I was sitting in the back and I was right behind Jimmy. And had known Jimmy and Miss Jo and loved them a lot, through the years that I was here. But this Sunday I was singing and I was worshiping and I wasn't even really thinking about it. And I remember that day they played a lot of the real old songs. And from all the years of singing, some of those harmonies are just down in there deep. And so it's just easy. And it just, what you always hope for in worship is that it can just flow out of you, that you aren't like stumbling over the song if it's something you don't know, that kind of thing. And so, but that day after church, Jimmy turned around and was like, I heard you singing. That was real nice. And that just touched my heart. I didn't even know what an accomplished musician he was at that point. I knew he was a songwriter. I knew he did his nights at the Commodore that I never got a chance to get to. But that just touched my heart that day. And, that was Jimmy and Jo. They were always encouraging and uplifting and doing awesome things. So, love them a lot.
My name is Donnie Winters, and I met Jimmy in 1970 while trying to garner some studio experience as a musician through our mutual friend Chuck Glazer. And I was fortunate enough to play on some of Jimmy's demos at that time. We later reconnected at the Commodore again, and he gave me a copy of a CD that he had made of his old demos, and on there was one of the songs that I played on, and it meant a lot to me. About 3 years ago, I had COVID and was in the hospital, and I heard from everybody on this back row behind me, and but it did my heart so much good when Jimmy called me and asked how I was doing, and I knew he was going through a similar situation as well. And we'd played many rounds together at the Commodore, and he was a great friend.
Speaking of telephone calls, how many of you received a call from Jimmy? Well, I tell you what, you can thank Amanda and I for that. We put Jimmy on our phone plan to just kind of help him out, and we didn't have an unlimited plan at that time, and we got a bill in the mail, and Amanda's like, Matt, you've been talking too much, and no, it's not me. I think you've been talking to, no, it's not me. Well, come to find out, it's Jimmy. He has racked our bill up to absorbent amount, so we had to change our phone plan to unlimited so that this guy could talk like he wanted to talk. So when you got a phone call from him, you can thank Amanda and I for that. No,
Okay, we're going to do one more thing before we wrap up today. And I think this is probably a first. It's definitely a first at Oak Hill Assembly of God. We're going to play a cheating song in the sanctuary. And we're going to let Jimmy lead us. So they're going to play a video here.
Place to do that at. I probably sang this song the very first time that I did the E.T. record shop down on Broadway. Because we wrote this song so many years ago. It's the hardest song that I sang, but somehow or another Jim Glazer don't have the problem with it that I do. But I wrote that with Jim, and I had the very first record, but I didn't do it as high as Gary Puckett came along and did it after he covered me. My record was played out in Los Angeles, and Glenn Campbell, I think, covered me first. And he was a good friend of Jerry Fuller at CBS Records. And Glenn had found by the time I get to Phoenix, and he was leaning more toward that, but he actually went in and cut Woman, Woman too. But he couldn't put it out at the same time. And so he told Jerry Fuller, who had just signed Gary Puckett in the Union Gap, and he said, why don't you cut this song on your boys? So he took it, Jerry took it down to San Diego. They were playing in a bowling alley, and they'd never recorded. Or never recorded together, I reckon. And anyway, it changed my life considerably after that. It's been cut over 100 times around the world, and probably 50, I think it's around 15 different languages. We picked up a co-writer every time somebody else translated that. But anyway, it goes like this. Have you got cheating on your mind? Oh, your mind. Something's wrong between us that your laughter cannot hide, and you're afraid to let your eyes meet mine. And lately, when I love you, I know you're not satisfied. Have you got cheating on your mind? On your mind. I've seen the way men look at you when they think I don't see, and it hurts to have them think that you're that kind. But it's knowing that you're looking back that's really killing me. Oh, mama. Oh, mama. Have you got cheating on your mind? Oh, your mind. A woman wears a certain look when she is on the move, and a man can always tell what's on her mind. I hate to have to say it, but that looks all over you. Have you got cheating on your mind? Oh, your mind. To do that.
Father, we thank you for this friend of ours that we love so much, and we can't wait to see him again one day with you. Pray for your blessing upon every person who's here today, God. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Thank y'all for coming today. Please stay. There are refreshments down in the fellowship hall. Hang out and just express your love to the family. God bless you.
Daddy